I went through my wife's closet after she left for her retreat. Every single bra was gone, but all her normal clothes remained. Natalie's suitcase sat by the front door for 3 days before she left, and I remember thinking it looked too small for a 2-week wellness retreat. She kept saying the program provided everything, that she only needed personal items and comfortable clothes for yoga and meditation. When I offered to help her pack, she smiled that nervous smile and said she'd already handled it, that the retreat had sent her a detailed packing list. The morning she left, her mom picked her up at 6 a.m. because I had an early meeting I couldn't miss. I kissed Natalie goodbye in our dark bedroom, her hair still damp from the shower, and she whispered that she loved me before slipping out. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand an hour later with a text from her mom saying they'd made it to the airport safely. I texted back asking Natalie to call me before her flight, but the message just showed delivered, never read. By evening, I'd sent 4 more texts with no response. Her mom finally replied around 8 p.m. saying Natalie's phone died and she'd call me once she got to the retreat and could charge it. Something about that explanation felt wrong, but I pushed the feeling down and focused on work emails until I fell asleep on the couch. 2 days passed with nothing except one text from Natalie's number that said she'd arrived safely and the retreat had a strict no-phone policy during program hours. The message was sent at 3 a.m. our time, which made no sense for any time zone she should be in. I called her mom demanding to know exactly where this retreat was located, and she gave me the name of some wellness center in Arizona that I immediately Googled. The website looked professional enough. Lots of stock photos of women doing yoga and getting spa treatments, testimonials about life-changing experiences. But when I clicked on the Book Your Stay button, it just led to a contact form with no pricing, no calendar, no actual way to make a reservation. I called the phone number listed and got a generic voicemail saying someone would return my call within 24 hours. Nobody ever called back. The next morning, I tried Natalie's number again, and it went straight to voicemail, like the phone was turned off completely. I started going through our apartment looking for any information about this retreat, receipts or brochures or confirmation emails. That's when I opened Natalie's closet and felt my stomach drop. Every single one of her bras was gone. All of them. I counted the empty hangers where she kept them organized by color. 23 hangers with nothing on them. But her regular clothes were still there. Her work blazers and jeans and sweaters. Her winter coat and rain jacket. Even her favorite sundresses she wore constantly. I pulled open her dresser drawers with shaking hands. Her underwear drawer was completely empty too, not a single pair left. But her socks were all there. Her pajamas, her workout leggings and sports bras. Everything else exactly where it should be. I went back to the closet and started going through everything more carefully. Her expensive heels were still lined up on the shoe rack. Her purse collection hung on the hooks she'd installed herself. Even her jewelry box sat on the dresser completely untouched, her grandmother's pearls and the diamond earrings I'd given her for our anniversary still in their velvet slots. What kind of wellness retreat required you to bring every bra and pair of underwear you owned, but leave behind literally everything else that had value? I grabbed my phone and called her mom again, this time not bothering with pleasantries. Why would Natalie take all her bras and underwear but leave her jewelry and laptop and nice clothes? There was this long pause before her mom said maybe the retreat provided specific clothing for the program, and Natalie needed her own undergarments for hygiene reasons. The explanation sounded rehearsed, like she'd been preparing for this exact question. I asked her point blank if she knew what Natalie was really doing, and she got defensive saying I clearly didn't trust my own wife, and maybe that's why Natalie needed time away from me. I drove to her parents' house without calling first, getting there just as the sun was setting. Her dad's truck was in the driveway, the same beat-up Ford he'd been driving since Natalie was in high school. But parked next to it was a brand-new Lexus SUV with temporary tags, the kind that cost $60,000 minimum. I knocked on the door, and Natalie's mom answered wearing a Burberry coat I'd never seen before, the real kind with the check pattern lining that costs over $1,000. She invited me in like nothing was weird, like she hadn't been avoiding my calls all day. The living room had a new sectional sofa, where their old furniture used to be, and I noticed her dad was wearing a Rolex on his wrist while he pretended to watch TV. These were people who'd asked to borrow money from us 6 months ago to fix their roof. Now they had luxury items everywhere, and my wife was at some mysterious retreat that didn't return phone calls. I asked where the money came from for all this new stuff, trying to keep my voice steady. Her mom's face did this thing where she looked guilty for just a second before the expression smoothed out. She said they'd had some unexpected good fortune, a small inheritance from a distant relative I'd never heard her mention before. Her dad muted the TV and joined the conversation, explaining how this relative had left them enough to get caught up on bills and treat themselves to a few nice things. He kept looking at his wife while he talked, like he was checking to make sure his story matched hers. I pulled out my phone and opened our bank app right there in front of them. 4 days before Natalie left, she'd withdrawn $8,000 in cash from our savings account. She'd also paid off both her credit cards completely, which totaled another $6,000. We'd been saving that money for a down payment on a house, and she'd never mentioned needing it for anything else. Her parents went quiet when I showed them the transactions. I asked if Natalie had given them any of that money, and her mom started crying, saying I was making terrible accusations and they'd never take money from their daughter. But her dad wouldn't look at me anymore, just stared at his new watch and said, maybe I should leave. I told them I was going to find out what was really happening, that if they knew where Natalie actually was and weren't telling me, they'd be in serious trouble. Her mom stood up and walked to the door, opening it and waiting for me to leave without saying another word. The next morning, I called my boss and took emergency family leave, then started searching for any record of this wellness retreat. The website didn't have a physical address listed anywhere, just a P.O. box for correspondence. The photos on the site were definitely stock images. I found the same pictures on 3 other wellness center websites with different names. When I tried to look up the business registration in Arizona, nothing came up under that name. I spent hours going through Natalie's email on our shared computer, and buried in her spam folder I found an intake form she'd filled out 2 weeks ago. The form asked normal questions about health and allergies, but the second page wanted to know about our relationship status, whether we had joint finances, if anyone would be looking for her if she didn't come home for a while. The last section made my hands shake. It said participants agreed not to disclose the retreat location to anyone outside the program, that all communication with family would be monitored to ensure privacy, and that the program fee was non-refundable under any circumstances. The program fee was listed as $15,000, paid up front. I checked our credit card statements and found a charge to something called Serenity Solutions LLC for exactly that amount, processed 3 weeks ago. I called the trafficking hotline because I didn't know what else to do, and a woman named Virginia Patel answered after 2 rings. I started explaining about Natalie disappearing and the weird phone calls and the luxury items showing up at her parents' house, and Virginia stopped me to ask specific questions about the timeline. She wanted to know if Natalie had been approached about this retreat by someone she trusted, if there had been any pressure to keep it secret, if the communication since she left felt controlled or scripted. I told her about the 3 a.m. text message and how Natalie called me by my full name instead of the nickname she'd used for 5 years. Virginia said what I was describing had all the markers of a coercive scheme, that legitimate wellness programs didn't require that level of secrecy or take every piece of someone's intimate clothing. She explained that these operations often recruited through family members who were struggling financially, offering them money to convince their daughters or sisters or friends to participate in programs that sounded legitimate but turned out to be something much darker. The family members became invested in maintaining the lie because they'd already taken the money and couldn't give it back. Virginia walked me through documenting everything without confronting Natalie's parents again, explaining that if this was an organized operation, they might move Natalie or cut off all contact if they felt threatened. She gave me a direct number for a detective named Isaiah Reeves, who specialized in fraud and coercion cases. When I called him an hour later, he'd already heard from Virginia and was expecting me. Detective Reeves asked me to email him everything I had, the intake form, the bank transactions, photos of the luxury items at her parents' house, screenshots of every text message from Natalie's number. He said cases like this were becoming more common, operations that use family networks to recruit women under false pretenses. They'd promise legitimate work or exclusive experiences, then gradually shift expectations once the women were isolated and felt like they couldn't back out. The fact that Natalie had taken every bra and pair of underwear she owned but left behind valuable items suggested she'd been told to prepare for very specific circumstances that had nothing to do with wellness retreats. Detective Reeves said he needed 24 hours to review the evidence and make some calls, that I should not contact Natalie's parents or respond to any messages from Natalie's number until he told me otherwise. I couldn't just sit in our apartment doing nothing, so I hired a private investigator named Dominic Ferrara, who specialized in financial crimes. I found his website through a Google search and called the number expecting to leave a message, but he answered on the first ring like he'd been waiting for something to do. I explained the basic situation, and Dominic said he could start immediately with a retainer of $2,000. I gave him my credit card information over the phone and sent him all the same evidence I'd given Detective Reeves. Within 6 hours, Dominic called back with information that made me feel sick. He'd traced the charge to Serenity Solutions LLC and found it was a shell company registered in Delaware with no physical location. The company had been created 8 months ago and had minimal public records, just enough to look legitimate if you didn't dig too deep. He'd also found the boutiques where Natalie's parents had purchased their luxury items, and when he showed the managers photos of the receipts I'd taken with my phone, they pulled up security footage from those dates. The footage showed Natalie's mom shopping with a woman in her 40s who paid for everything with a corporate credit card, never once looking at the total. Dominic said the same woman appeared at multiple stores on different days, always with a different family member of someone who'd recently gone to this retreat program. He'd identified 3 other women who'd disappeared under similar circumstances in the past year, all of them referred by family members who'd suddenly come into money. The pattern was exact, down to the luxury items and the controlled communication, and the shell companies processing payments. Dominic explained that these operations were sophisticated, using multiple business entities to hide the money trail and make it nearly impossible to connect everything back to whoever was actually running things. He'd already sent his findings to Detective Reeves, who'd reached out to confirm he was opening a full investigation. The detective said he needed me to act normal, to respond to any messages from Natalie's number like I believed she was actually at a retreat, to not let anyone know I was building a case. If the operation suspected law enforcement was involved, they might move Natalie somewhere we'd never find her. I had to pretend everything was fine, even though I knew my wife was being held somewhere under false pretenses, and her own parents had helped make it happen. 3 days after Natalie left, I got a call from her number. I answered on the first ring, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. Natalie's voice came through, but it sounded wrong, too careful and formal. "Hello, David. I'm calling to let you know I'm doing well and the program is helping me work through some things. I hope you're taking care of yourself." I asked her what our cat's name was, something so basic she'd answer instantly if this was really her. There was this long pause, then background noise like someone was coaching her. Finally, she said she needed to focus on her healing journey right now and would call again soon. I tried to keep her talking, asking questions only she would know the answers to, but she just kept repeating phrases about her wellness journey and personal growth. Then the call ended abruptly, like someone had grabbed the phone away from her. I immediately sent the recording to Detective Reeves, who called me back within minutes saying the background noise suggested someone was definitely there with her, possibly reading responses off a script or screen. The way she'd paused before answering about our cat meant she either didn't have the information or was being told what to say. Detective Reeves said his team had been working around the clock and they'd found something. The shell company had rented a property 2 hours north under a 6-month lease paid in full. The property was listed as a corporate retreat center, but the neighbors said they'd seen young women coming and going at all hours, always accompanied by staff members, never alone. The women all dressed in matching athletic wear that looked expensive, and the property had privacy fencing installed shortly after the lease started. Reeves explained that he couldn't just show up there and demand entry without probable cause, that he needed to build the case carefully so it would hold up in court. He was working with the district attorney's office to get warrants for financial records and communication logs, but that process took time. Meanwhile, Natalie and potentially other women were at that property under unknown circumstances. I wanted to drive there immediately, but Reeves made me promise not to. He said if I showed up, the operation would know someone was investigating and they'd disappear before law enforcement could act. The hardest thing I'd ever done was agreeing to wait while my wife was 2 hours away, and I couldn't do anything to help her. A week after Natalie left, Dominic called with an update that changed everything. He'd been investigating the woman who'd paid for the luxury items, and he'd traced her to 3 other states where similar operations had been shut down over the past 5 years. Her name was Patricia Vance, and she'd been arrested twice for fraud and once for promoting prostitution, but she'd never served significant prison time because the cases fell apart when victims refused to testify. Patricia had a pattern of recruiting family members who were desperate for money, selling them on legitimate-sounding opportunities, then exploiting the women who trusted their families. Dominic had found one woman willing to talk, someone who'd gone through Patricia's program 3 years ago in Nevada. The woman explained over a recorded phone call how the program started with normal wellness activities, yoga and meditation, and healthy meals. Then, gradually, the expectations shifted. They'd be asked to provide companionship to lonely clients, to dress in specific ways, to be more physically affectionate during sessions. Each boundary got pushed a little further with explanations that made it sound professional and consensual. By the time the women realized what was actually expected, they'd already crossed lines they felt ashamed about, and the operation used that shame to keep them compliant. The woman said she'd tried to leave twice, but they'd reminded her about the debt she'd accumulated for room and board and designer clothing they'd provided. They'd told her family had to pay back everything if she broke her contract early, that her mother would lose the money she'd been given as a referral fee. The psychological pressure was intense, making women feel trapped between disappointing their families and doing things that made them sick. The woman had eventually escaped when a client offered to pay off her debt in exchange for information about the operation, but by that point, she'd been there for 4 months. She'd tried to press charges, but prosecutors said the case was too complicated because she'd technically signed agreements and nobody had physically prevented her from leaving. The legal system didn't know how to handle situations where coercion was psychological and financial, rather than physical. Detective Reeves said this testimony was exactly what he needed to request emergency warrants, that the pattern of behavior across multiple states showed this wasn't just one bad situation, but an organized operation. He promised me they'd move on the property within 72 hours, that victim advocates would be on site to make sure the women were treated with respect and care. Those 72 hours were worse than the entire 2 weeks before. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, just kept replaying the phone call with Natalie over and over in my head. I kept thinking about how her voice had sounded so small and scared, how she'd paused before answering basic questions, how someone had clearly been there coaching her responses. Detective Reeves called me twice a day with updates, explaining that his team was coordinating with other agencies and making sure everything was legally airtight. They couldn't afford to mess this up because if the case fell apart, Patricia and her associates would just set up somewhere else and keep hurting people. On the third day, Detective Reeves called at 5 a.m., saying his team was moving on the property in 2 hours, that I should stay by my phone but not leave my apartment under any circumstances. If something went wrong, he needed to know where to find me immediately. I sat on the couch, watching the clock tick forward, every minute feeling like an hour. At 9:30 a.m., my phone rang. Detective Reeves said they'd entered the property and found 9 women present, including Natalie. All the women were physically unharmed but emotionally shaken by the sudden intervention. They were being taken to a secure facility with victim advocates who would help them process what had happened and understand they had choices now. I asked if I could see Natalie, and Detective Reeves said no, not yet. She needed time with the advocates to decompress and understand that she was safe, that nobody would pressure her or control her anymore. Pushing to see her too quickly would undermine all of that, even though I was her husband and had been the one fighting to find her. It felt wrong to be so close but still kept away, but I understood the logic. Natalie had spent 2 weeks in a controlled environment where her every movement and communication had been monitored and directed. She needed to remember what autonomy felt like before dealing with the complicated emotions of seeing me again. Detective Reeves promised to have the victim advocates call me with updates, that I'd be able to talk to Natalie on the phone once she felt ready. The call came 6 hours later. A woman named Simone Washington who explained that Natalie was processing a lot of shame and confusion about what had happened. She'd believed she was going to a legitimate wellness retreat where she'd work as a lifestyle consultant for wealthy clients, helping them with spa services and wellness planning. Her mother had pitched it as an exclusive opportunity that would earn enough money to help with our finances and pay off some of her parents' debts. Natalie had wanted to surprise me with the income, to prove she could contribute something major to our future. Simone explained that Natalie kept saying she should have known better, should have seen the red flags, should have told me from the start. The program had isolated women from their support systems by requiring them to hand over their phones and only communicate through monitored channels. The work had started exactly as promised, greeting clients and helping with wellness activities. But gradually the expectations shifted, and each time Natalie tried to push back, they'd remind her about the contract she'd signed and the money her parents had received. They'd tell her this was all part of high-end hospitality work, that wealthy clients expected a certain level of personal attention. By the time Natalie understood what was really happening, she'd already crossed boundaries she felt ashamed about, and that shame made it impossible to reach out for help. She was convinced I'd never forgive her, that her parents would be devastated if the money had to be returned, that she'd ruined everything. Simone said Natalie wanted to talk to me but needed another day to work with counselors first, to start understanding that none of this was her fault. I told Simone to please let Natalie know I loved her and didn't blame her for anything, that I'd wait as long as she needed. The next afternoon, Detective Reeves called with news about the arrests. His team had taken Patricia Vance and 3 associates into custody, charging them with fraud, money laundering, and promoting prostitution. The trafficking charges were being reviewed by federal prosecutors, but Reeves said they had enough evidence to keep these people locked up for years regardless. He explained that the operation had been running for at least 3 years across 5 states, targeting women through desperate family members who were offered substantial referral fees. The families became accomplices without fully understanding what they were participating in, creating a network of complicity that kept victims trapped. Natalie's parents had received $15,000 for referring her, with promises of monthly bonuses as long as she stayed in the program. The money had gone straight to paying off debts and buying luxury items they'd never been able to afford before. Detective Reeves said they were cooperating with the investigation now, providing details about how Patricia had approached Natalie's mom at her job and made the whole thing sound legitimate and exclusive. They'd truly believed they were helping us financially, that Natalie would be providing companionship and wellness services to rich clients who valued their privacy. 2 days after the raid, Simone called saying Natalie wanted to talk to me. My hands started shaking before I even answered the call. Natalie's voice came through small and tired, nothing like her normal, confident tone. She started apologizing immediately, saying she'd been so stupid to believe this was real, so naive to trust that her mom was actually trying to help us. I told her to stop, that she hadn't done anything wrong, that she'd been lied to and manipulated by people who knew exactly how to exploit trust. Natalie started crying and said she wasn't sure we could come back from this, that she'd done things she was ashamed of and I'd never be able to look at her the same way. I didn't know how to respond, because I honestly didn't know what our future looked like. This was damage that couldn't be fixed with apologies and promises. But I told her the most important thing was her healing and feeling safe again, that we could figure out the rest later with professional help. She said she needed to stay in the victim services program for a while longer, working with counselors and rebuilding her sense of self before she could think about our relationship. I told her I'd give her whatever space she needed, that I'd be here when and if she was ready. The weeks after Natalie's rescue were a blur of legal proceedings and therapy appointments. I started seeing a counselor twice a week to process the betrayal by Natalie's parents and the trauma of not knowing if my wife was safe. The counselor helped me work through the anger without letting it consume me, explaining that Natalie's parents had been victims of manipulation too, even though their choices had enabled harm. Detective Reeves kept me updated on the prosecution, explaining that they'd found evidence of dozens of other women who'd gone through similar programs over the past 3 years. The financial records showed the operation had generated millions of dollars in revenue through a combination of upfront fees, debt accumulation, and payments from clients. Patricia Vance had created an entire ecosystem of exploitation, hiding behind the language of wellness and empowerment while systematically breaking down women's boundaries and autonomy. The district attorney offered Natalie's parents a deal where they'd testify against Patricia and her associates in exchange for probation and restitution. They'd have to return the $15,000 they'd received and attend mandatory counseling about recognizing and reporting exploitation. I had mixed feelings about the deal because part of me wanted them to face harsher consequences, but I understood their cooperation was necessary to ensure convictions. 3 months after the rescue, Natalie asked if I'd meet her at a coffee shop with her counselor present. I got there early and sat at a corner table, watching the door and feeling nervous in a way I hadn't felt since our first date. When Natalie walked in, she looked different in ways I couldn't quite name. Thinner, yes, with dark circles under her eyes, but also steadier somehow, like she was learning to take up space without apologizing for existing. We talked for 2 hours about everything that had happened, Natalie explaining the psychological manipulation in detail while I forced myself to just listen. She described how the program had gradually normalized things that should have been huge red flags, each step small enough that she convinced herself it was fine. The financial pressure from her parents had been constant, text messages asking how things were going and reminding her how much the money meant to them. By the time Natalie realized what was actually expected, she felt trapped between disappointing everyone and doing things that made her sick. She tried to leave twice, but they'd shown her the contract and told her the debt would fall on her parents if she broke it early. The shame of what she'd already done made it impossible to reach out for help, because how do you explain to your husband that you've crossed lines you can't take back? I told Natalie that none of it was her fault, that she'd been deliberately deceived by professionals who knew exactly how to exploit vulnerabilities. But she pulled her hand away when I tried to touch her, explaining that she needed me to understand something important. She'd filed for a temporary separation to give herself space to heal without feeling like she had to perform or meet expectations. Our marriage might not survive this, she said, her voice breaking. She needed to figure out who she was outside of being someone's wife or daughter before she could be in any kind of relationship. The separation papers were already filed, and she'd be staying with a friend from the Victim Services Program who'd been through something similar. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach, but I forced myself to stay calm. I told her I understood and would respect whatever boundaries she needed, that maybe we could try couples therapy in a few months if she felt ready. She nodded and stood to leave, and I watched her walk out with her counselor. The coffee shop suddenly felt too big and too empty, and I sat there for another hour before driving home to an apartment that felt like it belonged to strangers. 4 months after Natalie's rescue, the trial for Patricia Vance and her associates began. The courthouse was packed with victims and their families, dozens of women who'd been through these programs over the past 3 years. Natalie testified via video link, with Simone sitting right beside her off-camera. I sat in the gallery watching her face on the screen as she described the recruitment process and gradual manipulation. She spoke clearly about how the program used family pressure and financial coercion to keep women compliant, how they made everything sound consensual while creating circumstances that made refusal impossible. The defense lawyers tried to argue that the women had signed contracts and were free to leave anytime, but the prosecutors destroyed that argument with evidence of the debt traps and controlled communication and systematic boundary pushing. After 2 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for 3 days before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia got 12 years. Her associates got between 5 and 8 years each. The judge specifically mentioned the predatory nature of recruiting through family members and the psychological manipulation involved. When the sentences were read, I felt this weird mix of satisfaction and emptiness, because prison time didn't undo what had happened to Natalie and dozens of other women. 6 months after the trial, I got a text from Natalie asking if I wanted to meet for coffee. My hands shook as I typed yes. She was already sitting at our old table when I arrived, looking healthier than the last time I'd seen her. We talked for almost 3 hours about everything and nothing. Her new job at a nonprofit that helped trafficking victims, my promotion at work, whether we thought our relationship could survive everything that had happened. Natalie said she'd been working with her counselor on understanding that being deceived by people you trust doesn't make you weak or stupid. It makes you human. She was learning to recognize when she was performing for others instead of being honest about what she wanted. I admitted I'd been working on similar things, realizing I'd sometimes confuse protecting her with controlling her, making decisions without asking what she actually needed. We agreed to try couples therapy, meeting once a week with a specialist who understood trauma and relationship dynamics. The work was harder than I expected because it meant examining patterns we'd both fallen into without noticing, ways we'd stopped really seeing each other. Over the following months, Natalie and I rebuilt something that looked different from our marriage before. We didn't move back in together, both of us needing our own spaces to feel safe and autonomous. The couple's therapy helped us learn to communicate about needs and boundaries without shame or defensiveness. Sometimes the sessions were good and sometimes they were brutal, both of us crying or getting angry or wanting to give up. But we kept showing up because underneath all the damage was something worth fighting for, a connection that had survived trauma, even if it looked different now. Natalie started a support group for other women who'd been through similar experiences, creating the kind of community she wished had existed when she first escaped. I volunteered as an advocate for families of trafficking victims, helping other people navigate the confusing intersection of love and betrayal and systemic failures. We learned that healing wasn't linear, that there would be good days and setbacks and moments of unexpected grief for what we'd lost. But we were facing it together, with honesty instead of assumptions, with boundaries instead of obligations, and with genuine respect for each other's autonomy instead of trying to control outcomes we couldn't predict. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments. Yeah.